Roger. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Saskatoon University.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I begin my remarks, I need to note for the Chair and for the House that I will be splitting my time with the honourable member, my good friend and colleague, the member for Cypress Hills Grassland. And also, Mr. Speaker, and I can bring everything back to relevance, but you're going to have to bear with me for one little indulgence, because I should explain to the House why I was unable to be here for the last parliamentary sitting week. And that was because my household welcomed a new 8-pound, 10-ounce little girl, Helena Isu, ESU for the people who are in charge of Hansard, that's her middle name, Trost. And so, Mr. Speaker, I wasn't away at some costume party in India or something like that. I was actually celebrating the birth of my daughter and doing some constituency work at the same time. And Mr. Speaker, these things always need relevance, and like every piece of legislation we are talking about, it always impacts our children's future. But this legislation is of particular interest to me, and for the members who have been here for quite a few years will understand why. Prior to my election to the House of Commons, I worked as a mining exploration geophysicist. Geophysics was what I took my education, was my primary degree at the University of Saskatchewan. So I actually worked in the field on mining mineral exploration projects. And for me then, when I read bills that talk about regulation, about impact of natural resources, it's not an academic question. Nowadays, increasingly, we have more and more Canadians who are removed from the production of primary goods. We see more and more people, as the joke goes, they think milk comes from a box in the store, it doesn't come from a cow. They think that, you know, houses magically appear, they aren't made out of lumber and wood. And the same thing happens with oil and gas and mineral resources. People often don't have a fundamentally good understanding of where these products come from or how the impact is or what needs to be done. So rather than going through some of the technical elements of the bill, which my colleagues are going to do very well here today, I want to talk a little bit about what this actually means to people on the ground. Because one of the things that needs to be understood by Canadians who are watching this, to people who do not live in primary natural resource communities, is what this actually means for the social well-being, for the health and other things of people in the areas. Because every time we make it more difficult to produce natural resource wealth from rural and remote areas, we completely and deeply impact the lives of the people who live in those areas. If you live in downtown Toronto, downtown Vancouver, or even my city, downtown Saskatoon, this is a remote issue for you. It doesn't actually impact your day-to-day life. Let me give an example of what things can actually change if you get mining oil and gas projects through. In the year 2000, I was an exploration geophysicist up in Baker Lake, Nunavut. Great community. The geographical center of Canada is just outside of town. The time in that community at that point had a high unemployment rate. There was naturally issues, and not all issues go away with economic development. But what happened in the following years after we were up there and working on the Meadowbank and the Melinda project that later on Cumberland Resources turned into a mine? Today, there is a gold mine not too far away from the community. They can drive there back and forth, and they take out the ore deposits. Baker Lake has less than a 0% unemployment rate. They have full employment there. And I had the privilege of sitting in at a committee hearing where actually representatives of Baker Lake actually came. They came and they talked about what this means to their communities. So when we talk about this legislation here, we're not just talking about things in the abstract. We're talking about a change in standard of living, a change in communities, particularly for our remote and rural areas. This has more impact on the social well-being of many of these communities than all the government projects combined. And that is why I think it should be, in many ways, a prejudice, not a negative prejudice, but a positive prejudice toward development in these smaller communities in particular. And that when in doubt, we should give extra weight to people who will get economic benefit from these projects. And that's what concerns me about this legislation that the government is bringing forward today. Because the government has taken away one very important element in this legislation that previously existed, and that was the concept of standing. Before you would go before the National Energy Board, before you would go talk to regulators, etc., you had to have some relevance to the matter. You had to be involved. You had to have something that connected. Could it be your technical expertise? Could it be financial interest? Or could it be community interest? But as we begin to expand and take away that legitimate and democratic connection to a project, we actually water down the voices of the people who have standing. Now, gold mines are not generally as controversial politically as oil pipelines. But just think, if Baker Lake had had major opposition from someplace, Norway, California, the United States, to the development of their gold mine. If someone had said they needed tourism, they needed other things there more than they needed gold mine, should the voices of the local people who would have benefited, whose lives would have changed, whose businesses would have developed, whose whole social structure would be added to and enhanced, be decreased? And that is what happens when you take away standing. It is a fundamentally anti-democratic provision because you allow people who really shouldn't be having a voice, a vote, on the issue by bringing in people who can influence it with no actual connection. The analogy would be letting people vote in my constituency who are not part of my constituency. We in Canada very much have that principle of there has to be some relationship to the representative, and the same thing needs to be held in regards to presentations on environmental projects, on things of this nature. So of all the things in here, that is what concerns me the most. The undemocratic nature of eliminating standing to allow people who can use their wealth, their influence to project power, not just inside Canada, but literally from outside of Canada. And that, I think, is not just an abstract point, it's a fundamental point that relates to the democracy and how we let voices and people govern themselves, and in this case, in a very specific point of legislation. The other thing that particularly concerns me in this legislation is the ability to take what appears to be set timelines and to turn them into continuous extensions due to certain loopholes in the legislation. Now, the minister talked about how everything is political, and if you don't like what the government does, you can vote them out. But again, as the point has been made in this debate, some areas of the country do not have nearly as direct a stake in this matter as do other areas of the country. If you live in Saskatchewan, if you live in the north, if you live in areas that are directly impacted, this is important to you. And so there should be a much stricter legal guidelines given to eliminate the loopholes of continuous delays that the minister and other actors under the Act are allowed to give. Because ultimately, if you're going to be able to do a project that's substantive, that's large, you need to have certainty. When I was a young geophysicist working in northern Manitoba, I remember just how many hours the senior geologists would work on developing the environmental plans, getting things for provincial government, roads. I mean, we had to check out everything from ice thickness to what happened to garbage and so forth. And one of the things I think people need to understand is the industry takes this very seriously. In fact, when I worked in the Yukon, we actually would have less environmental impact than many of the tourist groups and tourism parties that were there before us, and we'd actually pick up their trash around them. So that's why I think a lot of the general public's thinking that, what is a time delay, the public impact needs to be brought in, is somewhat misplaced. And that's why certainty actually needs to be there, because with all the good work the industry does in trying to be responsible, if they lose the certainty, capital will start to move. And the natural resource industry tends to be very cyclical. Money will move in huge amounts, and then it will flow out again very, very quickly. And so you have to be ready to move very, very quickly to catch those peaks in resource prices if you're going to be able to capitalize on. And with falling prices over the last few years, it hasn't been as good or as proper as it was in previous years. Now, as I conclude my remarks, I just want to make a couple points here. During some of the debate, we talked about how pipelines were not built to tidewater under the previous Conservative government. For the record, the Keystone Pipeline And the Alberta Clipper line were built under the previous government, approved and built. As was noted, other pipelines were approved and then cancelled by the later government, and the Line 9 reversal also happened. So these things happened. The job was getting done. And it's important that we continue to understand how this impacts people all across Canada, particularly in the rural and remote communities. Thank you.